Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? Excellent. My name is Carolyn No. I work for the Academy of Science. We're very pleased to be partners with the St. Louis Zoo to bring you conservation conversations. Many of you are Academy members and friends. For those of you who are not familiar with the Academy, I'd like to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about who we are. The Academy is an independent science organization supported entirely through community contributions. We have been connecting science in the community since 1856 and have a long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. This year alone, we have reached more than 5,000 students and adults through our broad range of free and low-cost public science programming, like the one you're attending today. If you'd like to receive e-notification of these and many more upcoming Academy and Zoo public lectures and events, I'll pass around some e-news sign-up sheets that will make their way around the audience. One final reminder, please turn off cell phones and/or any other electronic devices that may make noise during today's program. I do want to mention an event that you might want to attend. Tomorrow night, right here in the Living World Auditorium at 7:30 p.m. as part of our Conservation Conversation series, Dr. Greg Rasmussen from Painted Dog Conservation will be talking about tracking to understand Africa's endangered carnivore. And with that, I'd like to introduce Bill from the zoo to introduce our speaker.
Good evening. It's great to see so many people here tonight, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing John Newby. My name is Bill Houston. I'm the Assistant General Curator for the St. Louis Zoo and Director of its Saharan Wildlife Recovery Center. And it's in that latter role that I first became aware of John Newby and the work that he's done in the Sahara. John is an interesting character because for many, many, many years, and I'm talking decades, he was quite frankly, the only person who was speaking out loud about the silent crisis of extinction that was underway in the Sahara. And it was John that I have to credit with getting not only the St. Louis Zoo involved in conservation in the Sahara, but the entire international zoo community through the effort that he made to raise more awareness about what was going on and to galvanize support. John has devoted nearly 40 years, or actually over 40 years of his life, I give his age away here, to conservation in the Sahara and in the bordering short dry grasslands of the Sahel. He started as a student at Aberdeen University. Upon graduating, he took a flyer, went and looked at a posting online or on the bulletin board. They didn't have online back then, and saw a position, a volunteer position in wildlife management, working with the wildlife department in Chad at the Ouadi Achim, Ouadi Rimé National Game Reserve. And I think that's where he first got hooked, because he went from that to a number of different positions throughout his life, including living in Chad and Niger together probably for over 22 years, and working for various organizations like IUCN and World Wildlife Fund along the way. At World Wildlife Fund, he was actually at one point director of the Africa and Madagascar programs, and we were very fortunate in the zoo community when we met John and we were able to work with him and create an organization called Sahara Conservation Fund that is the only organization in the world dedicated exclusively to conservation of Saharan wildlife. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my good friend John Newby, and really appreciate all of you coming out tonight to hear him speak.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Let's get this show on the road. If we can have that screen off and this one on. There we go. Sahara Conservation Fund. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Caroline, for the invitation to be here tonight to speak as part of the Academy of Sciences St. Louis show program, and also to the St. Louis Zoo for making my visit to St. Louis possible. It's always a real pleasure to be back in St. Louis, which I consider to be my home from home. I spend quite a lot of time here on the basis of the fact that it's thanks to the St. Louis Zoo that this organization, Sahara Conservation Fund, exists, and that we're able to work in this part of the world with so many critically endangered species. In the past, I've had the pleasure of talking in this auditorium generally about the work of the Sahara Conservation Fund, but tonight I want to talk specifically about a project that we're in the process of implementing and developing at the moment concerning one particular species, the scimitar-horned ORYX. And the title of the talk, as you can see, is Ghosts in the Sand. Not only am I going to focus on the recovery of this species, which is extinct in the wild, but luckily present in fair numbers in captivity, but also the role that this species plays as a flagship species in the conservation and recovery and restoration, not only of other species, but the habitats necessary for their survival. This work the presentation is going to be organized around three main points. I'll say a little bit about the ORYX to begin with, something about the reasons for the decline and extinction of the species, and then the bulk of the program will be about the project which we're currently implementing to restore this extinct species back to its native habitat in Central Africa. The project is, like all of our work and like all of conservationists' work, is really the fruit of cooperation and partnership. It's very rare that a project will be able to be implemented without the support of many, many partners. And it's really important that we recognize these cumulative efforts that go into making work possible. And we're particularly grateful to the inputs of St. Louis Zoo in this undertaking. As Bill said, there is a Saharan Wildlife Recovery Center as part of the WildCare Institute here at St. Louis. But also we work very closely with Martha Fisher, the coordinator of the Antelope Taxon Advisory Group, which is responsible for coordinating and organizing technical input into the recovery of ungulate species, antelopes and gazelles primarily, such as the scimitar-horned ORYX, which is pictured here. And as you can see, we have broad support for this program from the US, from European zoos, but also from the Middle East and from multilateral international organizations such as the Convention on Migratory Species as well. Quite a number of partner organizations providing either financial or technical support, or in some cases both. Let's say just a few words now about the ORYX itself. It's a large antelope. Unfortunately, there are none at the St. Louis Zoo for you to go and see, but there is a related species called the addax. It's a desert species, which you can see in the zoo here. And I encourage you to take a look at it. It's one of the most remarkable animals. Anyway, the scimitar-horned ORYX is a grassland species. It's much less of a desert species than the addax, and it inhabits those grasslands, the short, dry grasslands that are sub-Saharan in distribution, in areas where rainfall is around 10 to 12 inches a year. So not so much rainfall, but some nonetheless. It's a species very much like the American bison, which also inhabited grasslands, as you know, of the United States, that existed formerly in millions and millions because there was very little competition on these grassland plains until livestock came along and development reached these areas. It's the same situation for the ORYX, which was quite abundant up until relatively recently. It is extinct in the wild today, and it has gone within the space of, should we say, 100, 150 years from a situation of being abundant across most of its range, which spread all the way from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Nile Valley, to being extinct in the wild. The captive status, luckily, is moderately good. There are ORYX in captivity in a number of countries and in fair numbers, but as I will say later on, quantitatively, there are lots of ORYX. Qualitatively and genetically, the base of those populations, captive populations, is not as strong as it could be. The distribution, historically, here you can see it's what they call peri-Saharan. It's this area of sub-desert which surrounds the Sahara. As you can see, the dark red on that map there reflects the historical distribution. This is the historical distribution going back maybe some 2,000 years. We have records going back that far from Roman occupation of North Africa. They left some fantastic mosaics of the animals that were present and that they hunted at that time. So we have representation of the oryx from what is today Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. So we do know they existed north of the Sahara, even though the amount of habitat available to them is relatively small relative to that available to them south of the Sahara, where you really do get significant grassland habitats that are suitable to this species. The sort of thing I'm talking about really are the African prairies, what I call the African prairies. It's this short to moderately high grassland, many annual species, and you can imagine that during times of rainfall there is growth, rapid and abundant growth of grasses, which gradually over the course of the year dry out, and apart from some of the perennial grasses and the sparse tree cover, dry up pretty much during that course of the year. The animal, the oryx, became extinct in the wild sometime in the 1980s or early 1990s. We don't know exactly, partly because the numbers were very small at that time, and partly because the countries where the remaining populations existed, mostly Niger, Chad, and Mali, were in a state of political unrest and military activity and insecurity. So it was very difficult to actually witness the extinction of the species, shall we say. But we're pretty much certain that the last ones disappeared in the 1980s or early 1990s. The photograph you can see there is the last known photograph of the animal in the wild, and that was a photograph that I took myself in 1980. So they did last a few more years beyond this, but not much. And the result of what I will talk about is that they became extinct in the wild. This is quite obviously a significant development for a species, especially a large species like this. The causes of that extinction are primarily overhunting and poaching. There is no doubt that these animals became, as modern vehicles, all-terrain vehicles started to penetrate the Sahara, as people had access to modern weaponry, machine guns and the like, and as the Sahara became opened up for military, should we say, conquest, insecurity, civil war, mineral, petroleum exploration, there were all manner of activities which all had a heavy impact on the species, and they're very easy to hunt because they inhabit these open grasslands, which means they can be tracked down and pursued and killed in large numbers very quickly. Secondary causes for the disappearance of the species include desertification and loss of pasture, the severe and prolonged droughts which occasionally occur. They don't occur very often, but when they do occur, they do have an impact on wildlife. Loss of habitat due to development, agricultural development, for example, in areas which used to be occupied by the oryx, had some impact on habitat. And the lack of resources for conservation. This part of the world really has not benefited at all until very recently, benefited from conservation spending like other parts of the world, like the tropical rainforest, for example, or the marine ecosystems, the wetland ecosystems, the savanna ecosystems, which have received far more conservation attention and funding. So, but anyway, the overhunting and poaching were definitely the main causes, the major causes. To begin with, that poaching pressure was traditional. People hunted. This photograph was taken in about 1975. At that time, by and large, people living in the major areas where the oryx remained didn't have access to vehicles nor guns, but they were able to carry out some traditional poaching using horses. They ran down the animals with their horses, and they used either dogs to run the oryx down, or they used the horses with spears, throwing spears and long lances, which they used to kill the oryx with. And this was a very low-level form of exploitation, which was totally sustainable given the amount of hunting that could take place and the numbers of animals which existed at the time. Here's another picture taken more or less at the same time here. At that time I was working in Chad with game rangers, and one of our duties was to track down oryx poachers. And here we managed to catch up with a hunting party. The camels would be used to carry water for drinking and for the horses. And as the water was used up, the dried meat from the oryx that was hunted was piled on the camels until the water was all gone and the meat was there. And by which time, after 3 or 4 or 5 days, the people would pack up and leave the area because there was no water for them to carry on using that place. Another picture here of another hunting party that we apprehended poaching in the 70s. As I've said, a lot changed with insecurity and the arrival of modern arms and weapons. And from a hunting activity which one could describe as being sustainable, the situation rapidly degraded into one which was unsustainable. And obviously, as you can well imagine, that during times of civil war, not only is there a heavy impact from the armed forces and the rebel groups that are operating in the Sahara, but conservation can't take place either. So it's really a double whammy in terms of us being able to do anything to prevent this type of extermination, unfortunately. I did say that there were other factors. Desertification certainly is a factor, and with climate change scenarios predicting that the desert areas are going to become more desert-like in the Sahara, I think that there is going to be significant loss of habitat, but most of the loss of habitat is going to be to the north of the range of the oryx. And there are expectations, in fact, that the oryx's main habitat, the grassland habitats, may even get wetter than they are at the moment, which may lead to an increase in grassland. But that increase in grassland may not always be available to the wildlife, because cattle and other forms of livestock exploitation and development will also take place in the wake of that increase in pasture. Drought. The impact of drought. These animals are drought adapted. They're highly mobile species. They need large spaces. Their first reaction to drought is to move away and look for viable areas of pasture and grazing. Most of their water, I should mention here, these animals, they probably get 2 or 3 or 4 opportunities to drink during the year, and that is it. For 9 to 10 months of the year, they have access to no free water. So they're sustaining their water requirements through the vegetation that they consume. Fleshy plants, wild melons, leaves of trees, and other forms of plant material provide them with the moisture that they require for their physiology. During periods of drought, however, that isn't so easy. And not only do adults die, as you can see the adult female oryx on your left, my right, but also calves are abandoned by their mothers, and reproduction rates drop off almost to zero during these periods. They do, after the rainfall comes back and after the pasture comes back, the reproduction rates do go back up again. So it's should we say, the process is, the populations used to be viable. They used to be able to sustain these kind of stochastic events, which had heavy impact during short periods of time, but the recovery rates were also quite high when the population numbers were quite high. But as the population numbers became lower, obviously the capacity to recharge after a drought period also became more and more difficult. The species, because it's become extinct in the wild, and has been extinct in the wild now for nearly 30, going on 35 years, during that time the clock hasn't stood still. And so any oryx that we are able to take back into the wild are not going to face the same situation that their ancestors faced 35 years ago. that as we move forward, so the challenges, there are going to be new challenges. Poaching, we may be able to control poaching, we may be able to control hunting, but other forms of, which used to be, should we say, secondary threats, may well become the primary threats of the future. And the biggest threat here is habitat loss and fragmentation, and also competition from livestock. Pastoral development has gone ahead in these areas, which is absolutely normal. The human population, as I'll say a little bit more about later on, is also very well adapted socioeconomically to exploit these grassland areas. So there is a lot of potential for competition. There is also potential for cohabitation as well, and which is the basis for a lot of the conservation thinking behind this project as well. Agricultural encroachment also is increasing, which is having an impact on habitat availability for the oryx. And much of this the agricultural encroachment is really poverty driven. People don't have any other option but to carry on exploiting the land into more and more marginal areas because they don't have alternatives, which allows them to break out of that vicious cycle. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, there really are no winners from this type of situation because the agriculture isn't really very productive and it destroys the land. And so again, you've got a vicious cycle of poverty, land encroachment and land degradation and desertification, which is in the interests of no one. Very, very difficult cycle to break out of. Okay, so the question is there really, given all of these challenges and threats that are out there, is there really a chance for the future of the oryx in the wild? And we believe there is. I think one has to have a lot of enthusiasm. One has to be very optimistic. And I think the key assets of a conservationist are optimism. Some people would call it lack of reality, but if we give up as conservationists, well then who is going to do anything about this? We can't just sort of wash our hands and say, well, it isn't worth trying, because that isn't going to get us anywhere either. So we do believe that there are solutions, and those solutions have to be thought about very, very carefully, because we're looking at solutions that not only are going to be effective in terms of the wildlife and the habitat of the wildlife we're looking at, but also they need to be effective in terms of creating situations of mutual benefit to local people who are also exploiting and living in these grasslands as well. In terms of the oryx in captivity, there are a number, as I said earlier, there are a number of oryx in captivity. These are bred in zoos like St. Louis, although oryx is not here at this particular zoo, but the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums has species programs for the oryx. But numbers in the zoo community, numbers of places or spaces for the oryx is relatively limited because it's a big animal. It's space hungry, and most of the zoos don't have the capacity to hold big numbers. But there are animals in captivity which are being bred specifically and maintained specifically for reintroduction into the wild. Relative to the animals in captivity in zoos, there is a much, much larger number of animals, of oryx, for example, in private hands. And a good example would be Texas, where the private landowners and ranchers in Texas are holding something around 11,000 scimitar-horned oryx in private hands on their holdings. So there are animals out there which could be used for reintroduction programs. There are also significant numbers of animals in the Middle East that were part of collections which were made in the 1960s and 70s. And here is a little bit of film here of one collection that we're working with. This is in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And these oryx originated in the 1970s, 60s, 70s and 80s, probably from Sudan and Chad at the time. And this group of oryx you can see here just up against the fence there, these are some of the animals that we hope to send back to Chad as part of this project. They're currently being screened for health and screen for genetics, the genetic basis. Many of the there have been attempts to reintroduce the ORYX so far, but many of these reintroduction projects have been based on relatively small numbers of animals being taken back to relatively small enclosures in areas where there is there are relatively few opportunities and possibilities for release of these animals back into the wild because the habitat isn't there, or should we say, the people who are holding the animals are reluctant to let them go because they fear they won't survive or they will disappear across boundaries, frontiers into neighboring countries. So far, there have been animals, should we say, repatriated to former range states, but not yet reintroduced back into the wild. An example is here shown with these ORYX in Senegal that were taken back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, were put in a relatively small captive area, fenced area, and they do very well. They do very well within limits, but the carrying capacity of these small protected areas is very limited. And as the numbers of ORYX grow, the pressure on the habitat increases, pasture quality is reduced, and calls for supplementation of food and water to keep them alive. It's also in these sort of concentrated populations, as soon as any kind of disease or illness gets into the system, it has catastrophic events. And so you get these massive boom and bust type situations where numbers grow quite rapidly because it's a very productive animal. But just as quickly numbers can drop because foot and mouth disease, for example, or other illnesses get into the population, and because there's such proximity between the animals, there are significant die-offs. The project that we're working on in the Republic of Chad is based on a rather ambitious approach. We hope to work with large numbers of animals instead of small numbers of animals because there are large numbers of animals available. We want to work in areas where opportunities for release exist because there is habitat availability, and we want to work in a way which allows us to move very quickly from a situation of repatriation to release into the wild, and do that very quickly so that we can learn about the process as quickly as possible and really get the process moving forward. The area we're focusing on is, as you can see from that original distribution map, this is the Ouadi Rimé, Ouadi Achim Game Reserve in central Chad, marked out in blue there. And as you can see, it is a protected area which was established in the 1960s specifically for the ORYX before it became extinct. So there is lots of habitat there, and it's right in the middle of the range of the species. So ecologically, we're aiming at the right sort of place. Chad here you can see on the map. It's a very isolated, landlocked country, but it's a very large country right in the center of Africa. A long way from anywhere. But that, in many cases, is an advantage. As I said, the reserve was created in the 1960s specifically for this species and other desert species, which are now critically endangered also, which brings me around to the original point of the talk. And one of the points of the talk is to recognize that although the objective of this project is to reintroduce the ORYX into the wild from captivity, the very fact that we're doing that in an area where there are existing populations of other critically endangered species means that the project will have a multiple impact and hopefully provide resources and encouragement to look after other species at the same time. Flagship. It's a word you've probably come across already. Flagship species. They do serve this purpose of being catalytic. They're well-known species, but by conserving them, especially the ORYX, which is a very space-hungry species, if you conserve the ORYX correctly by establishing large areas of protection, all of those other species that share the same habitat will benefit from that protection. So it is providing it's playing a flagship role, and from a habitat perspective, it's what we also call an umbrella species, because others in its shade will also benefit from the conservation activities. We also hope that by using an ambitious approach for this project, that it will act somewhat as a model for other projects of this nature, not just for the ORYX in terms of reintroducing it into other countries, but also for other species which are also in need of restoration and reinforcement. One of these species is the DAMA gazelle, which you can see in St. Louis Zoo. It's a critically endangered species. It's very, very rare. There are probably less than 300 of these left in the wild. They are extremely threatened because the remaining populations, there are about 4 populations that are left, and each one of these populations is separated by several hundred, in some cases 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers. So there's very little chance of these populations intermingling and creating large critical mass. We're talking about individual populations of 60, 50, 60, 40 animals. The Ouadi Rimé, Ouadi Achim reserve, where we're taking the ORYX back to, also contains at least 1 population and possibly 2 populations. Now we've discovered a second population, a small population of a dozen or so animals. So efforts on behalf of the ORYX will also have a beneficial impact on behalf of the Dama gazelle. Another species which will also benefit is the DORCAS gazelle. This is a smaller species. It's abundant. Abundant. It used to be abundant. It is still common in some parts of Africa. It is completely absent in others. It just so happens that Ouadi Rimé Reserve, and it's a good indicator species for that reason, in the Ouadi Rimé Reserve, it still remains relatively common, which is a good indicator to us that there is potential there for the conservation of other species. Had this species been absent from the Ouadi Rimé, Ouadi Achim Reserve, we would have been extremely concerned about the future of an ORYX reintroduction project. We're probably looking at the densest remaining population of DORCAS gazelle in the planet today in that area. And in some areas we're talking 6 to 8 gazelles per square kilometre at certain times of the year, which is relatively high. Other species which will benefit from this activity are the Saharan carnivores, and there are quite a number of carnivores. Most of the smaller carnivores, like the fennec on the left-hand side there, and the Ruppel's fox, the pale fox, the common or golden jackal, most of these animals are relatively common still. That cannot be said for the Saharan cheetah, which is exceedingly rare. And again, a species that will benefit from the role of other flagship species functioning as catalysts for conservation in areas where this animal can be restored to its native range. It's not just about mammals, it's also about birds. As you probably know, there is an extinction crisis going on for vultures, especially the larger vultures. The situation in Africa is not quite the same, thankfully, yet as it is in Asia, where populations of the large vultures have plummeted in some areas by as much as 98, 99%. There are still fairly good numbers of vultures like this lappet-faced vulture here. We're talking, this is a huge bird. This has got a 12-foot wingspan and weighs about as much as a turkey. So it's one of the biggest flying birds of all. There are still quite healthy populations in some parts. And again, the larger birds, some of the ground-living birds, the bustards, and sand grouse that inhabit the grassland areas will also benefit from conservation efforts in these areas. So there's quite a large number, quite a large palette of species which will benefit from a flagship species like the ORYX and work to conserve it. The goals of the project in Chad, as I say, primarily there to reintroduce viable free-ranging population of scimitar-horned ORYX. In doing so, obviously, one has to take into consideration the habitat of the scimitar-horned ORYX, and so work will take place on a parallel track simultaneously to protect the habitat of the species within the Ouadi Rimé, Ouadi Achim Game Reserve. It's a vast reserve. It is something in the order of 30,000 square miles in size, which is a little less than the state of Indiana in area. So it's a vast area which will come under conservation attention. The project, as I say, will have an impact on these other species which are present in the area and which can be restored to the area. We may also have the opportunity through the implementation of the project of bringing back other species that have disappeared from that area as well, which would include the Saharan ostrich and the addax. And ultimately, one of the big goals and one of the biggest challenges facing the conservation of wildlife in the Sahara today is this issue of reconciliation between pastoral development and wildlife conservation. It really is a significant factor. I am convinced that although hunting and poaching certainly was the major cause for the decline of these species up until now, the future for these species is not going to depend so much on the control of poaching. I think that is handleable. The biggest challenge is going to be reconciling land use, especially pastoral development, with wildlife conservation. So there's going to be a change in the agenda, if you like, as we go forward. Pastoralism is the best form of use for this type of marginal, low rainfall area. And so there's no doubt from a human and social development perspective, this is great, this is fantastic. This is the best way to use these grasslands, is through sustainable livestock management and pastoralism. And that is exactly what is happening, except very little attention is being paid to the impacts of this form of development on the habitat itself and on wildlife in particular. And part of that problem is due to I would say, the unplanned expansion of the number of wells and sources of water which are being drilled, boreholes which are being drilled in areas of grassland, which formerly were not available to livestock or to pastoralism, but were available to wildlife. And those sort of no man's land wilderness areas are gradually being colonized for livestock development, which ultimately will have an impact on wildlife, but also will have an impact on pastoralism itself. The area is also used for other secondary, if you like, byproducts of nature, and there is still a thriving practice of the harvesting of wild grass seeds. In normal years, when it rains well, this is an activity one sees frequently, but it's an activity which really comes into its own during years of famine, when people need all the available sources of nutrition they can get their hands on. So again, managing the land to maintain sustainable use of things like wild grass harvest is also a very, very important factor in socioeconomic stability and development. And as I said previously, the nomadic way of life, which still exists and is very vibrant in all of these Sahelian-Saharan countries, really is the best way of using these enormous, vast arid land grasslands to best effect. These people are far from government. They have no support. There is no social security. There is very, very little funding comes their way, very, very little development. And while the system is left alone to function normally, people are able to survive. But the more one tampers with the system, the more one reduces the sustainability of the practice. And so development needs to take place very, very carefully, because it's a very fragile balance which exists between land use like this and destruction of the land. A large part of our work focuses on building relationship with the people who use that land. And I say here, purposefully meeting folks on their level. It's critically important that we try to understand what the local people feel about their environment, what they need. It isn't for us to come and say, well, you must do this or you must do that. we need their help more than they need our help, especially when it comes to wildlife conservation. And so there needs to be a respectful relationship developed that really does take into consideration the realities of the people who are exploiting that land and living and will be, should we say, asked or requested to cohabit with reintroduced species in the future. That is critically important. We spend a lot of time talking with the people, explaining the project, talking about these animals that were certainly well known in the past, especially to the older members of the community. And here you can see a group of Arab nomads. This was a lunch stop. We just stopped for lunch under a tree, and a bunch of people gathered round and were curious to know what we were doing. And it was a wonderful opportunity to start talking about the ORYX reintroduction project. And it was really interesting, the dialogue that took place. Everybody knew about the ORYX. Their grandfathers and their fathers had seen this animal. The children had heard about it. Everybody was very keen to have the animal come back again. But they were very, very specific in saying, yes, we love the ORYX, we want the ORYX, we like the gazelles, that's fantastic. But for goodness sake, don't bring back the hyenas, because they will eat our livestock and they will eat our sheep and goats. And again, this is the reality. I mean, we have to be very, very realistic in understanding there needs to be a quid pro quo and a balance found that allows cohabitation and partnership to move forward. It's a long process, and it calls for a lot of thinking, a lot of talking, a lot of dialogue, a lot of mutual understanding, and there are no shortcuts. I think it took Moses 40 years to get out of the desert. I mean, it'll take that long, possibly, for us to find the solutions. But at the end of the day, there are solutions if we are willing to dialogue and keep an open mind as to some of the solutions that are out there. In terms of this project, the next steps are things are well advanced, finalizing. We've got, obviously, the government of Chad, the recipient government, needs to be fully on board. It is. The operations are very expensive. We are working closely with the authorities in the United Arab Emirates. This is a project, to give you an idea, over the 5-year first phase of this project, it's probably going to cost something in the order of $6 to $8 million to implement, and that would include transport of animals from the Middle East, from Europe, from America, to Chad, which is an expensive business. These, obviously air flights have to be carried out. We're talking about releasing large numbers of animals, 400 to 500 animals, to quickly build up a viable population in the wild. Community outreach, as I say, is critically important. Unless we have the support of the local communities, we're not going to get very far. Short term, we can do anything with technology, but sustaining that technological leverage which we can put on the project to begin with, sustaining that is not going to call for technology. It's going to call for cooperation and partnership. And again, as I say that, I can't really underline that often enough. It's a significant and critically important element of the project. The animals, the first animals that go out there, we're hoping to release in the first phase, or in the first year, 100 animals, about 100 animals. Each of those animals is going to be equipped with a satellite collar, a GSM collar. So the information on the movements and the social structure of the herds of those animals will be recorded. We'll be able to sit in St. Louis and monitor where those animals are if we need to. But of course, there will also be people on the ground. There will be local community game guards and community extension agents on the ground who are also out there monitoring these animals and learning from the animals, so that we can quickly move to subsequent releases, maybe 50 to 100 animals at a time, until we build up the numbers significantly enough so that the population is viable. And we hope that all of this, we can start getting the first animals on the ground within the next 12 months. It's an ambitious target. Just as this project is an exceedingly ambitious project, something of this scale has never been tried before. It's relatively easy to point out the shortfalls and the weaknesses of what has happened to date, but going that next step and trying to break through all those bottlenecks is going to call for imagination, it's going to call for taking a leap of faith, really putting large resources into breaking through those bottlenecks and working very hard to get those animals back on the ground. But that is a leap of faith that we're ready and willing to take with the support of our partners. If you would like to follow us and follow up on this project, there are a number of ways of doing so. We have a website, saharaconservation.org. We also have a Facebook page, which is, I guess, like most Facebook pages, is more focused towards news and allows you to keep a more regular update on what is going on, a more immediate update in what is going on than the website. If you want basic information on the species concerned, on the projects, the website is the place to go to. But for news, Facebook page, or our regular newsletter, Sanskrit, which often has articles on the projects we're implementing, including this project. Information, I have some information here. I have a brochure here. I've probably got enough copies if everybody wants one. Please come and take one of these. It's got all the information on how you might be able to follow up on this, and we really would welcome your support in any way, shape, or form. And through any of these media, if you have any sort of queries or any sort of questions as to what we're doing, please feel free to do so. I mean, we're completely open and hopefully transparent in what we do, and we want to use our conservation work as a platform and a launch pad for improving conservation, not only in the Sahara and Sahel, but in other forms of other parts of Africa and the world where the similar sorts of issues and situations arise, where restoration of wildlife, which is becoming increasingly necessary, needs to take place, and how the dynamic between human population and development interfaces with conservation. It's a really critical part of the conservation agenda. It has been in the past. It's been ignored largely in the past. In the future, we cannot ignore it, because the future of species like the scimitar-horned ORYX, the addax, and many, many, many other species, not only in this ecosystem but in others, depends on finding that modus vivendi between human populations and nature, which are going to allow wildlife to be sustained in the centuries to come. And with that, me and my friend the Fennec, thank you for listening to this talk, and if you have any queries, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I'm almost afraid to ask this one. That ranch in Texas, are they using any of those animals for canned goods?
I guess some are, yes. Many, there are many ranches down there. I don't know how many ranches there are. There may be 8 or 10 or 12,000 ranches down there. I guess you find all. You find hunting ranches, you find conservation ranches. We've just with Bill Houston from the zoo here, we've just been down to Texas to talk with the conservation-minded ranchers about the possibilities of working with them to use their animals for reintroduction back into the wild. And I think for every canned hunter down there, there's probably 100 ranchers down there that really are genuinely interested in using their animals for conservation. But I guess it's like in all walks of life, you get all shades and all colors. Sorry. Yeah, there's currently, as you may know, there's a debate going on regarding the scimitar-horned ORYX and a couple of other species as to whether they should be included on the Endangered Species Act. At the moment, permitting is required through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the use of these animals. And there's a debate going on whether that should be the case or not, depending on whether these animals are considered to be captive-bred animals or wild animals. I think it's quite a complicated, but I don't fully understand it myself. But the hope is, the bottom line is that when a species becomes extinct in the wild, we really have no other option but to go to captive-bred populations if we want to restore it. So we need to identify all of those players that can play a positive role in helping this process forward. And I think because of the relatively small numbers of ORYX that the zoo communities are able to hold because of space and cost, increasingly we should be looking to the private animal holders as a source of these animals. And I think what we're seeing is that there is a growing interest on the part of the private owners to get involved in conservation. And I think many of them don't yet understand either the potential that they have for helping conservation, or maybe the way to go about it. And so that's one of the things that we try and do, is to try and raise awareness for these opportunities to actually support conservation more actively. Already by keeping these animals alive on their land is already helping, because if they weren't doing it, the species would be completely extinct and we would have no possibility whatsoever of bringing it back. But it's a delicate issue. It's a question of dialogue, it's a question of understanding, it's a question of bringing people on board and getting them to hopefully see our point of view on all of this. Sorry, there was a question back there.
Yes. Is the Chad government going to be the main force in making sure that the land is managed in such a way that the ORYX can stay alive out there? That's probably the greatest obstacle in the future.
From a legislative perspective, yes, absolutely. I mean, the Chadian government, the Chadian authorities, the Ministry of the Environment, the Wildlife Service, all have a role to play in making that possible. I think we have to be very realistic about how much capacity and resources they have to do that job. So it's really going to take a partnership. One of the things we are currently working on is with the local communities, is talking to them and asking them what their needs are. How can we develop a win-win type situation where they will actually benefit from the conservation of these species? And some of the things that are being thrown out as ideas are improved health care, education, veterinary care for livestock, all of these kind of things. All of these things which the Chad government only has limited resources for because it's a very, very poor country. So if the Chadian government can help us with the legislative aspects, we can try and garner support to help with the developmental aspects. We obviously can't replace the Chad government in doing its job. It has sovereign right over its land, over its people, etc., etc. What we can do is help where we can and help find those resources needed to build those dispensaries, for example, or to ensure that healthcare is extended to these people who very rarely see a doctor and are still dying of diseases like measles and polio that most of the world has managed to get round. Yes, sir.
What is the part of the plan that has to do with protecting the reintroduced ORYX in terms of poaching?
Well, a lot of that depends on the government. And I'll tell you why. Because over the last 10 to 20 years, the biggest threat hasn't come from the local people. The biggest threat to the wildlife has come from the military. It's come from the people who legally bear arms, who legally drive government vehicles. The current president of Chad, Idriss Déby, 3 years ago, put out an extremely strong message to his military forces and said, I do not want to have any more problems regarding hunting of gazelles. At that time, we weren't talking about the reintroduction of ORYX. We were talking about gazelles at that time. And I can assure you, I have seen with my own eyes that the edict that he put down 3 years ago has already had a very, very positive impact. He has control over his military. He doesn't have necessarily so much control over the local people, but the local people were not the major threat. So I do believe with that kind of strong government support, strong legislation, strong policy reform in terms of hunting, I think we can deal with this poaching issue. Ed?
John, what are the population densities of people and livestock right now?
Well, I can't give you exact numbers, but they're still relatively low. Relative to the space, relative to the pasture that's available. They are growing. Numbers of human population is growing, even in areas which are marginal like this. Livestock numbers are growing, because of wells development, for example. There's a lot of trade going on between Chad and neighboring countries where meat is less available and is higher value. So there is pressure on the land. But relatively speaking, one of the initial pieces of research that we did when we identified the areas most appropriate for this project was to look at human population density and land use. And Chad came out as being a relatively low density areas relative to other parts of Africa such as Mali or Senegal, where the land has been converted much more rapidly. Chad still remains largely undeveloped in that central area. And the use, and I say again, it's not only a question of development, it's the nature of the development as well, that pastoralism, traditional pastoralism, nomadic pastoralism is still the prime form of land use. There isn't any intensive land use, there's no intensive agriculture, there's no infrastructure development, there's no petroleum exploitation in that part of the world. So it's relatively speaking, it's still a wilderness relative to other parts of Africa. Yes?
You mentioned that the plan is to release up to 500 animals, but then you said you hope to release like 100 in the first year, so will it be released them like in waves that you can transport them?
That's correct, yes. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. The idea is we worked with population modelers who told us that given the situation in Chad, the climate, the rainfall, the drought situation, desertification, we fed all this information into a model. The model told us that we would need on the ground as quickly as possible to have something like 500 ORYX, so that if there ever was a drought period, or if there ever was a problem with disease, though there would still be a viable population would remain even after that impact. Numbers less than 500, the possibility of them surviving and being a viable population was relatively low. Once you start reaching 500 animals that start functioning as a breeding population, splitting up, dispersing, moving at will, and breeding, then you start building this sort of sustainability into population growth. The idea is to move. We can't move 500 all at one go. It's just too much of an endeavor to do that. What we want to do, however, is we really want to learn and make sure we're doing the right thing. And we have to do that with numbers which are big enough to provide the lesson, but not too big to be unmanageable. So we figure if we can get 100 animals with satellite collars, each one of them, which is an expensive undertaking. Each satellite collar we're talking $3,000 to $4,000 without even calculating airtime per animal. That's an enormous investment. But the reward will be we will have a unique opportunity of watching that population move and grow, associate, disassociate. We'll be able to monitor all of that. We'll be able to learn from those first 100 pioneer animals. As we learn from those 100 animals, then the idea is to continue boosting that population, knowing more or less, or knowing a little bit more about how they're going to react. Don't forget, all of these animals are going to be totally naive. They have never seen the desert like this. They've been fed in captivity, they've been watered, they've been given food, they've been given pelleted food, they've been given alfalfa. You know, they're going to be totally naive. So any kind of innate sort of learnt behavior that their ancestors had has to be completely learnt again. And so we're going to share in that learning process with them as we put these monitors on the animals. Bill.
John, I would just add to that, just to put it in perspective, in typical reintroduction programs, you might feel very fortunate if you had 10% of your animals that you're releasing with radio collars on them. So when John says this is a unique opportunity and being done in a way it's never been done before, he's absolutely correct. We will have a tremendous amount of data about that first pioneer group of animals that goes out there that can really help us drive more quickly towards what's working and what needs adjustment. The other thing that I would add is that, to what John said, is that there is, fortunately for all of us, a tremendous amount of data on how other ungulate species, related species like we're not just starting from scratch. We know an awful lot about what it takes to rehab these animals and get them ready for the wild.
Thank you, Bill. Ed, yes, again.
So, John, is it planned to do a hard release or a soft release when these animals are first put out?
That is a good question. By hard release, Ed means the time we're going to keep these animals in quarantine, basically, before letting them go into the wild. Soft release means the softer the release, the longer you keep the animals before letting them go. What has happened to date is the animals have not been let go at all. So it isn't even a soft release. The idea, though, is to keep the animals for as short a period as possible that we can do responsibly. So if we're obligated to keep the animals more or less in quarantine for 30, 40 days to see if there are any health issues which we need to catch before the animals go out into the wild. Were there any issues during transport, for example? Were there problems which were imported when the animals were imported? So we quarantine the animals. That is an obligation, both in terms of good husbandry, but also for veterinary and veterinary health purposes. Beyond that period, though, obviously then, as I say, we're talking about naive animals that have no experience of Chad or this part of the world. We're really going to have to monitor the situation very closely, but the objective is to keep them in captivity for as short a period as possible, because the project is not going to achieve its goals if we keep those animals penned up. It's only going to start achieving its goals once we let them out into the wild. Now, if, for example, we bring these animals in during the colder months of the year, which in this part of the world are the same as over here, November, December, January, February are relatively cool periods of the year, probably the best time to transport the animals. There'll be less stress. But that cool period is very quickly followed by an extremely hot period where temperatures are up in the 112, 115, 120. No rainfall whatsoever. So if the animals come in, should we say, in January or February, we'll probably want to keep them during that hot season in captivity so that we're not exposing them immediately to the harshest time of the year. But after the hot season, the rainy season comes. And so if the rains develop nicely, as one would expect, that is probably the moment to let them go. So we're looking at I would say, a fairly soft release. It's not hard, but again, it's a responsible release. And again, at the end of the day, the wildlife managers on the ground will have to decide. They're going to have to say, the time is right or the time isn't right. They're going to have to take that risk and make that judgment call, depending on what the environment and climate is doing at the time. Yes?
What are the natural predators that either are in place or would need to be added once the population becomes great enough?
The natural predators for a full-grown adult oryx are very, very few. In the long, long distant past, there were occasional opportunities where lions would migrate north during the rainy season, and the oryx would come down south to meet that area where the first rains had fallen. And there were examples of oryx being killed by lions, but that was exceedingly rare. Once an oryx becomes full-grown, it has very few predators. This is one of the reasons why they became so abundant and long-lived. They're a long-lived animal. The young, however, although they're very well looked after by the female, the mother, they're very well looked after and very aggressively looked after by the female. They can become prey to jackals. They can become prey to striped hyenas. They can become prey to spotted hyenas. But again, this is the nature of the beast. This is the way ecology functions. And I don't think there will be, certainly the jackal population still remains very good, very strong. Striped hyenas have been persecuted, but there are still fair numbers. I don't think there's going to be any need for an intervention at that level at this stage of the game. I think that at this stage of the game, the key objective is to build numbers up as quickly as possible so that the oryx gets a new foothold in its environment.
John, I would just add to that experience tells us through the repatriation much trouble adapting to protecting their young jackals. We don't see the kind of lag time in learning how to raise their offspring in that environment that we've seen with other species. They pretty much get down to the business of protecting those young and running the jackals off, and we're not hearing a lot of stories about how we put our ORYX out and they didn't know what to do with the jackals. It's the jackal's detriment, not the ORYX, when the ORYX arrive.
Yeah. I'm really pleased to see so many young students here. What about you guys? Have you got any questions? No? I was perfectly clear? even in my Brit accent? Yes?
After you release, like, the amount that you want to, do you plan to just let them be on their own, or do you plan to release more after that?
Yeah, more will be released. We figure once the population gets established, it will start breeding normally, and the numbers will increase naturally. We probably, after that first 500, we probably won't have to bring any more back. That's the hope. By that time, there'll be herds have formed. The animals will reproduce normally, and the numbers will grow. They reproduce very well. There are species that the gestation period for the RX is about 8.5 months. Okay? So, but as soon as the female has given birth, she is ready to receive the male again almost immediately, which means that there isn't an annual. It's more. They get a better than an annual birth rate. So over a 2-year period, 2 years and a bit period, you may get three calvings if the conditions are right. But the conditions have to be right. As I said in the talk there, that if there's a drought situation, or if the pasture isn't very good, or etc., all of those problems, it'll reduce reproduction rates. But they have the potential to increase very, very rapidly. This is one of the paradoxes. You have a species which reproduces exceedingly well in captivity and yet is extinct in the wild. It's a crazy situation. Yeah.
What is, like, the average, like, lifespan?
About 17 to 20 years. This is what we know about animals in captivity. In the wild, of course, the situation is generally less. The captive animals, zoo-kept animals, tend to live a little bit longer than the ones in the wild. But it's roughly that. It's between 15 and 20 years. So it's quite a long-lived animal. And they usually start breeding. In theory, they can breed as early as 2.5, 3 years. But normally they would start breeding maybe 4, 5 years, 3, 4, 5 years. So they have a long reproductive life in front of them. Yes?
I was curious, the radio collars, do they self-recharge somehow, or how do you handle keeping them powered?
Well, we don't. What we're likely to use is obviously the latest technology, batteries. That we can probably count on 1.5, maybe 2 years battery life. And progress is being made all the time in increasing the battery life. One of the other things we're working with is collars that have an automatic release clip on them. So when the life of the battery reaches its end, you can program the collar to fall off. So the animals are no longer going to be encumbered by a collar. Not that it really encumbers them, but ethically, that's the way to do it. Get rid of that collar once it's no longer used. And we can then recuperate the collars, and then they can be refurbished and used again on other animals. This technology is increasing all the time, and because it's being used more and more, and the more it gets used, the more pressure there is on these companies that are developing the technology to improve things, especially the size of collars as well. I mean, it used to be that you would put huge, great big collars on these animals, and now increasingly, I mean, you can build collars that are very, very small. Yeah.
Is it likely that the DAMA gazelle is heading toward extinction, or is there a program of
If nothing is done, absolutely. If nothing is done, absolutely. Sahara Conservation Fund has the Chad project working on Dama gazelles. It also has a project in Niger, in the neighboring country, working on Dama gazelles. We're doing what we can do in these two countries to try and keep the should we say, the majority of the animals left alive conserved. Efforts have been reasonably good. There are still young Dama gazelles being born in the wild. We've been working now for 4, 5, 6 years on this species, and I would say that the situation has stabilized, which already I think is a step in the right direction. What we need to be doing more and more now is ensuring that we can get these populations to increase. And one of the things that we're looking at, again, is rather ambitious. It's rather new. It's the idea of what is the word, Martha? Population. There is a word for it. I forget what it is. But it's bringing it's supplementation. It's called. It's looking at the possibility of actually bringing reinforcement. Yeah. Reinforcement. Bringing animals from captivity and reintroducing them into the wild while the species is still alive in the wild. In the past, what has happened is people wait for the species to go extinct, or it goes extinct in the wild, and then they think about restoration. I think people, especially with the Dama gazelle, you have to absolutely, the first priority is to stop the animal going extinct in the wild. Because as soon as it's gone in the wild, getting an animal back after having disappeared from the wild is incredibly difficult. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of money, there's a lot of political resistance here and there to making it happen. So if we lose those animals, we must not lose those animals. And if we can reinforce those populations with captive-bred animals, I think that's one way of doing it. And I think that's something the Dama gazelle is probably going to be one of the first animals, or first large hoofed animals, ungulates, that this has been tried on. Martha, you know better what has been done before, but I would guess this is probably one of the solutions, one of the outcomes of in the next 10 years. Yeah.
Will you be introducing more females and males in this one?
That's a good question. Probably, yes, I think so. I think the population modelers have told us those first releases, we're probably looking at 50-50. Because we need to learn as much about the behavior of the males as we do about the behavior of the females. But I think, logically speaking, starting with a higher proportion of females is probably a good thing. But I don't think it'll be vastly skewed. I think it may be 60-40, or it may be something like that. Some of the animals that have come over will probably already carrying young. There'll already be pregnant females coming over. So we should get the process should get kick-started fairly rapidly. Yes.
Is it normally just single births?
Yes. Yeah. I personally worked with this species in the 1970s. With the last wild populations, I never saw twins. Never. I'm not saying it never happens. It may happen, but it certainly is not the rule. The rule is a single calf. Please.
Will there be a significant decrease in the amount of water available when they're reintroduced, and will that take an adaptation for a naive animal?
What will take place during that soft period while they're still in captivity is that their access to water will be increasingly limited. Obviously, animals that have been habituated to drinking at will, although they do not drink every day necessarily, they have access to water permanently. There will be an education period, and part of the process is going to find out whether they are able to adapt to those situations. Intrinsically, physiologically, behaviorally, they have that possibility. Whether they're accustomed to using that faculty or not, and how quickly they use it, is one of the things we're going to learn.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
The other thing I would add to that is this first group of animals is coming out of United Arab Emirates, which is extremely desert conditions. The animals do have access to water there, but not in the same way that we think of, provisioning animals here in zoos. So they're not as naive as say, an animal coming out of the St. Louis Zoo would be. The other thing is physiologically, most ruminants in general are actually capable of existing on a lot less water than we offer to them. They'll certainly take it if you offer it, but they have the capability of creating what they call metabolic water too. As they break down their food, some of the molecules that are
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And don't forget, take a brochure on SCF, Sahara Conservation Fund. Don't be shy coming forwards.